I am 90, for years old now, and when people hear that number, they usually assume the hardest part of aging is memory. They imagine that the mind fades first. In my experience, that is not what disappears. The first thing that quietly slips away from most people is movement. Strength fades long before awareness catches up to it. And by the time you notice, something very important has already been taken from you. My name is Dr. Eleanor Whitaker. For 40 years, I worked as a clinical physiologist and rehabilitation instructor at a medical university in Boston. My job was teaching younger therapists how the human body weakens with age and how to slow that process down. I spent decades lecturing about muscle deterioration, nerve signaling, balance control, and something we used to discuss often in our research meetings: the silent loss of strength that begins long before anyone feels old. I understood the science in great detail. I could explain exactly how the muscle fibers in the legs shrink over time. I could show students charts describing the loss of motor neurons that connect the brain to the muscles. I could describe how the body gradually produces fewer proteins needed to rebuild muscle tissue. It was all very clear in textbooks and lecture halls. What I did not fully understand was how easily knowledge can remain theoretical while life continues moving forward. For most of my adult years, I lived a busy life. Teaching, publishing research papers, attending conferences, reviewing studies written by colleagues around the world. When you spend your days surrounded by intelligent people discussing complex ideas, it becomes very easy to believe that understanding something intellectually somehow protects you from experiencing it personally. I believed that for a long time. I was never overweight. I walked across campus every day between buildings. I took the stairs instead of elevators most of the time. In my mind, those small habits meant I was taking care of myself. I told students that structured strength training was essential for preventing muscle decline, yet I quietly convinced myself that my ordinary routine was enough. Looking back now, I can see how common that kind of thinking is. People assume that because they move occasionally or stay busy, they must be maintaining their strength. Unfortunately, the human body requires something much more deliberate than casual activity. The moment that forced me to confront this truth happened when I was 9 years old. It was a quiet autumn evening, the kind where the air outside carries that crisp smell of fallen leaves. I had spent the day grading exams and answering emails from graduate students. My husband Thomas had already gone upstairs to bed while I finished washing a few dishes in the kitchen. When I finally turned off the lights and walked toward the staircase, nothing seemed unusual. I had climbed those steps thousands of times during the years we lived in that house. They were familiar, ordinary, almost invisible in my daily routine. I placed my foot on the first step and tried to lift myself upward. Instead of rising smoothly the way my body always had, my leg trembled. It was not dramatic. It was simply uncertain. The muscles that should have pushed my body upward hesitated, as if they had forgotten their job. At first I thought I was tired. I had worked a long day, and perhaps my legs were simply fatigued. I paused for a moment, then tried again. The same thing happened. My knee wobbled slightly, and I had to grip the railing with both hands to pull myself upward. Each step required effort that had never existed before. By the time I reached the top of the staircase, my heart was beating faster, not from fear, but from confusion. I remember standing there in the dim hallway trying to understand what had just occurred. Nothing about the staircase had changed. Nothing about the house had changed. The only thing that had changed was my body. That moment was not painful or dramatic, but it was deeply unsettling. For someone who had spent a career studying physical decline, realizing that it had quietly entered my own life felt strangely humiliating. I had been teaching others how to prevent this very thing, yet I had ignored the advice myself. The next morning, I decided to test something. Before making coffee, I walked back to the staircase and climbed it again, paying close attention to the sensation in my legs. The weakness was still there. It was subtle, but unmistakable. My thighs burned slightly after only a few steps, and I needed the railing more than I had ever needed it before. In that moment, the scientific knowledge I had carried for decades stopped being abstract information. It became personal. Muscle decline does not arrive suddenly like an accident. It arrives quietly. Year after year, the body loses a small percentage of its strength. 1% here, 2% there. The changes are so gradual that the mind adjusts without noticing. You simply avoid certain movements without realizing you have begun avoiding them. You take elevators more often. You sit down sooner than you used to. You ask someone else to carry heavy bags. None of these actions feel significant in isolation, but over time they form a pattern that slowly reduces the demands placed on your muscles. And when muscles are not challenged, the body interprets that as a signal that they are no longer necessary. This process has a name in medical science, but the name itself is less important than the reality behind it. After the age of 50, most people lose measurable muscle strength every year unless they deliberately challenge their bodies. The most alarming part of this process is that the muscles responsible for climbing stairs are among the first to weaken. The quadriceps in the front of the thighs provide the power that lifts the body upward. The gluteal muscles stabilize the hips and generate force during each step. Smaller stabilizing muscles around the pelvis maintain balance, while the body shifts weight from one leg to the other. When these systems weaken together, the act of climbing stairs transforms from an automatic motion into a difficult task. I began observing people more closely after my experience on those stairs. At the grocery store, I watched older shoppers choose elevators instead of escalators. In my own neighborhood, I noticed neighbors using railings more heavily than they once had. Most of them probably assumed it was simply part of aging. But the truth is far more complicated. Age alone does not remove strength from the body. Inactivity does. This realization forced me to confront an uncomfortable question about my own habits. If I truly understood the biology of muscle decline, why had I allowed myself to drift into the same pattern of neglect I warned others about? The answer was embarrassingly simple. I had convinced myself that I was too busy. There is something about professional life that makes people believe their schedules excuse them from caring for their own bodies. Work feels urgent. Emails demand responses. Meetings fill the calendar. Exercise becomes something that can always be postponed until tomorrow. Tomorrow eventually becomes years. Standing there at the bottom of that staircase one quiet morning, I realized I had reached a moment of decision. I could continue ignoring the gradual loss of strength and allow the process to continue unchecked, or I could begin correcting it while there was still time. That choice may sound dramatic when described now, but at the time it felt surprisingly ordinary. All I did was place a chair in the middle of my living room. I placed that chair in the center of the living room for a reason that would have looked almost ridiculous to anyone watching. It was not an elegant exercise machine or something you might see in a modern fitness studio. It was an ordinary wooden chair that had been part of our dining room set for nearly 20 years. The finish on the backrest was slightly worn where hands had rested over the years, and one leg made a faint clicking sound when it touched the hardwood floor. I stood in front of it for several seconds, studying it as if it were some kind of laboratory instrument. In truth, that is exactly how I was thinking about it. After a lifetime in science, my instinct when facing a problem had always been to experiment. The experiment was simple. I sat down. Then I stood up. Then I sat down again. What surprised me immediately was how much effort that basic movement required. Sitting down had always felt passive, almost effortless. But when I slowed the motion and paid attention to the muscles in my thighs, I could feel them working far harder than I had realized. The descent into the chair forced my quadriceps to control my body weight in a very deliberate way. I stood up again and repeated the motion. By the 10th repetition, my legs were shaking slightly. I remember laughing quietly to myself because the realization was both humbling and oddly exciting. After decades of studying the human body in research settings, here I was rediscovering the simplest movement patterns as if they were entirely new. What fascinated me most was how quickly the body responded when challenged correctly. The first few days were difficult. My legs felt heavy after only a small number of repetitions. I had to grip the back of the chair occasionally to maintain balance. But something subtle began changing within 2 weeks. The trembling sensation started fading. The muscles in my thighs began feeling firmer when I climbed the staircase. The act of standing up from a seated position became smoother. These were small improvements, but to someone who had spent years studying physiology, they were unmistakable signs that the body was adapting. Muscle tissue is remarkably responsive when given the proper stimulus. When fibers are placed under controlled stress, microscopic damage occurs within the muscle cells. That damage might sound harmful, but it is actually the trigger that tells the body to rebuild the fibers stronger than they were before. In younger people, this rebuilding happens quickly. In older adults, it occurs more slowly, but the mechanism remains the same. Age changes the speed of adaptation, not the possibility of it. This was a truth I had taught for years, yet experiencing it personally made it far more meaningful. After the first month, I added another small challenge. At the bottom of the staircase in our home, there was a single step that separated the hallway from the living room floor. I began using that step as a training tool. Instead of simply climbing the staircase once each night, I practiced stepping up and down on that first step repeatedly. I placed my right foot on the step, pressed through my heel, and lifted my body upward. Then I lowered myself slowly back to the floor. The downward movement was the most important part. Lowering the body under control forces the muscles to lengthen while carrying weight, which creates a particularly strong stimulus for rebuilding muscle tissue. At first, I could only perform a handful of repetitions before fatigue set in. But repetition has a way of turning effort into familiarity. Within a few weeks, I could complete 20 step-ups on each leg without needing to rest. During this time, my husband Thomas watched these routines with mild curiosity. One evening, he leaned against the kitchen counter and asked why I had suddenly become so determined about exercises that looked so simple. I told him the truth. I explained that I had spent decades teaching others how to preserve their strength, but had ignored my own advice until my body forced me to confront it. I told him that if I wanted to remain independent in the coming decades, I needed to rebuild the strength that had quietly faded. He listened for a moment and then nodded thoughtfully. The next morning, he joined me. That small moment remains one of my favorite memories. Two aging academics standing in the living room, slowly sitting and standing from the same old chair like students learning a new language. There was something almost joyful about the simplicity of it. As weeks turned into months, we added other movements to our routine. Balance exercises became particularly important. I began standing on one leg while holding onto the back of the chair, lifting the opposite knee slightly toward my chest. At first, the position felt unstable. My body swayed gently, forcing the smaller stabilizing muscles in my hips and ankles to work harder than they had in years. Balance training might seem unrelated to stair climbing, but in reality, the two are deeply connected. Every time you climb a step, your entire body weight rests on one leg for a brief moment. If the muscles responsible for stabilizing the pelvis are weak, that moment becomes dangerous. Falls rarely happen because someone trips dramatically. They usually occur because the body fails to correct a small imbalance quickly enough. Strength and balance operate as partners. One without the other leaves the body vulnerable. The most interesting change I noticed during those months was not physical, but psychological. The fear I had felt on the staircase that first evening began fading. Confidence returned gradually as my legs regained their strength. Confidence is something people rarely associate with muscle tissue, yet the connection is undeniable. When the body feels capable, the mind relaxes. Simple movements no longer carry the quiet anxiety that something might fail unexpectedly. I began climbing the full staircase again without gripping the railing so tightly. The motion felt smoother. The burning sensation in my thighs diminished with each passing week. Eventually, the staircase returned to what it had always been, a simple path from one floor of the house to another. One afternoon, about 6 months after beginning those small exercises, I stood at the bottom of those same stairs and realized something remarkable. Climbing them felt easier than it had felt in years. Not just easier than it had felt during that frightening evening at 69, but easier than it had felt even a decade earlier when I assumed my daily walking routine was sufficient. The explanation was straightforward. Walking maintains cardiovascular health, but it does not place enough mechanical load on the major muscles of the legs to stimulate meaningful growth. Without that stimulus, muscle fibers gradually shrink. Structured resistance, even something as simple as rising from a chair repeatedly, forces the muscles to rebuild themselves. I began sharing this realization with former colleagues and students. Many of them were surprised by how little time these exercises required. 15 minutes a day was enough to begin reversing years of gradual decline. The problem was never complexity. The problem was always consistency. People imagine that maintaining strength requires elaborate gym equipment or hours of strenuous workouts. In reality, the body responds most reliably to simple movements performed regularly with attention and control. What matters is not how impressive the exercise appears. What matters is whether the muscles are challenged often enough to remind the body they are still needed. Looking back now, I sometimes think about how easily I could have ignored that first moment of weakness on the staircase. It would have been very simple to blame fatigue or age and continue living exactly as I had before. If I had done that, the decline would have continued quietly. The muscles would have weakened further. Eventually, the staircase would have become something I avoided entirely. Instead, that small moment of embarrassment became the beginning of something much more valuable, a renewed relationship with my own body.